Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens. You may want to grab your pen and paper or your laptop for today's episode. You will likely be taking notes. This one feels like it's the culmination of the entire year's work that we've been doing on the podcast. The reason is because we have Thomas Moore on with us today. And while we've had other incredible perspective-shifting therapists on, like Lisa Marciano, Dr. Laura Fielding, and Dr. James Hollis, Thomas Moore is a psychotherapist who also teaches other therapists how to be better at their job. So imagine you're going to hear from the person that your therapist could have learned from. It's like your therapist. His name might be familiar because of the classic New York Times bestseller, Care of the Soul. And he is the author of more than 20 books on spirituality and depth psychology. He's been practicing this for more than 35 years. He lectures, he gives workshops all over the world. He's been a monk. He's been a university professor. He lives in New England with his wife, Joan, and I can tell after reading his book, Soul Therapy, The Art and Craft of Caring Conversation. It's brand new, it came out in May. It's published by HarperCollins. He really wants the layperson to become better at helping another layperson. I mean, he has a true passion for caring for the soul that, for lack of a better word, is quite precious. This is so important because words like compassion and empathy and kindness are being used more frequently in our society, and they're being used by people who can barely show it themselves. And if they say it, they think they're showing leadership. But in so many instances, the how-to part of it is missing. So how often have you found yourself in a situation where someone came to you with a deep question or concern, and you just didn't have the right words to use, or you couldn't genuinely put yourself in their shoes and feel their pain? I know this is going to be a powerful episode because what he says holds true for anyone who is helping a friend, a relative, or a client. The goal is to offer simple guidance so therapists can become better at what they do, and generally, more people can become therapeutically sophisticated. As he writes in his book, the world needs this right now. We are all therapists at times, and it would be helpful for the average person to know how to counsel another person well. So Thomas, welcome to the Rising Laterally podcast, and thanks for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this for a while now.
Wonderful. And honestly, the pleasure is all ours. I was telling you off air how much this book changed my life. And so I'm really excited to get into it. I know there's a lot of great insight. Jay and I have plenty of questions. But before we get too deep, we wanted to learn a little about you. So let's start with where you grew up, what life was like at that time for you, and maybe a description of a few of the key pit stops along the way that led you to this journey and this moment with this brand new book.
Okay, I was born in Detroit, and I was born into a family of plumbers. And I think I always say that's one of the reasons that I write simply. You know, I wasn't born into a group of university professors at all. But when it was a Catholic family, very devout Catholic family. And when I was 13, I left home to study to be a priest and also entered a monastic order. Monastic isn't exactly the right word, but it's close enough. Okay. And so I lived that life for 13 years, and it still influences me. I think it's in this book. Even though I'm in such a different place than I was then.
Right.
But, you know, still it was a big influence. So I'd say that was the first step, to get away from, my family was absolutely beautiful and wonderful, but it was like getting into a bigger world, leaving home at that early age.
Absolutely. Widening the perspective, especially at age 13. Yeah. I mean, that's really pretty early.
Yeah, in what ways do you think that experience still influences you today? You mentioned that it still has a sort of foundational impact.
Well, I learned a lot of things. First of all, during my entire adolescence, I was living under a vow of chastity and poverty and obedience. And so I learned early on how to internalize one's one's passions and desires and your life, kind of your automatic life. I never felt that that I had to give up my sexuality. I didn't feel that, because I felt that this intense community life I was in gave me something very rich. So that was what I got in return for that vow.
Mm.
And so I learned that. I learned about that. I learned the importance of ritual, and I began to study music, and I was in charge of music and ritual the whole time I was there. So I have a great love of ritual and that particular kind of music. The music that's used for those purposes, for meditation, things like that. So that was a big influence. And also, I still feel that I'm a theologian. That's one of the things I do, not in the usual sense. I don't belong to any particular religion, but I think this is a good time these days to be a theologian of the world, or a theologian of the planet, where your job is to explore the great mysteries of life. And you do it in a way that is informed and supported by the religious traditions, but not limited by anyone.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things when you start to look across barriers and you start to really become a student of the world. In many cases, those are the times when you find out about your own ignorance, and that's when you can grow from it.
Absolutely. Well, I think that my feeling right now, you didn't ask this, but I'll tell you, my feeling right now about the religious situation is that I think that the formal religions, the institutions, have made huge mistakes with the material they had. They could have done wonderful things. And in many cases, they did, but they also messed things up by becoming moralistic, which is one of the tendencies of anyone who's spiritual. You tend to get moralistic in spite of yourself. And dogmatic, you think you know everything and that kind of stuff. So I think that's the problem there. On the other hand, the traditions have beautiful, beautiful music and poetry and ideas and I mean, everything. They have so much to offer. Architecture, art, just amazing. So I still feel that, I guess I'm answering your first question. I still feel that I have that theologian's attitude with me, even though now I speak primarily in the terms of depth psychology.
Absolutely. I mean, something that you've mastered. And so, look, you grew up in the Motor City, and I'm sure you probably liked cars. And, you just told us about what you learned in those 13 years. And now you probably like to know about the cars that are appearing in people's dreams. I mean, it's been quite a journey. So, your book covers soul care in many different ways. Tell us why, to you, soul care is so important. How does it help us become more human? And what do you actually look for in your clients? What are you looking for in their souls when they come to you?
Well, first of all, I've been saying this ever since Care of the Soul 30 years ago when it came out. I've been saying that as I understand it, therapy or care of the soul is not about fixing or making better or adjusting better to life, anything like that. I think people who are very soulful are often not terribly well adjusted. That's really not a judge. That's not one of the criteria of what makes a soulful person, that they're well adjusted to the society, because the society is kind of crazy, very neurotic at best. So if someone's adjusted to the society, I wouldn't call that a very good position. So what I look for is more the individuality. Soul to me is like a spring inside you. It's like a spring, meaning like a water coming up, bubbling up out of you. And yourself, your identity comes out of that. And it's very mysterious. You feel that some of it has to do with your parents and your family, and yet not all of it. And some of it has to do with the time you were born, and some of it has to do with just yourself, who you are. But that identity bubbles up from you. And I think it makes a demand on you. Like it says, go this way, go that way, be an individual. Don't just follow the crowd, because the whole idea of paying attention to this water, the spring of water flowing up out of you, is to be an individual, to be unique. So if you're doing therapy, there's a tendency doing that, whether it's formal or informal, to help a person be like everyone else and normal. We say normal. But actually, I think that the whole point is to let your individuality show.
That's very interesting. Yeah, one thing that we've learned in the past year is that actually nobody's normal, and we are all on a spectrum. Once we can kind of set that as the foundation, it becomes a lot easier to relate to other people and even relate to yourself. So how would you help some people who have certain wounds that they just can't overcome? They feel like they're always going to be with them forever. How would you help someone overcome some of those wounds that seem so permanent?
Well, the first thing I do, I follow some of the things I've learned from my teachers, Carl Jung and James Hillman, people like that. What they would say to me is to what we say, go with the symptom. So I would want to find out what is going on with somebody, what their problems are, and not try to get rid of them. If my intention is to get rid of them, I'm working against who they are. I mean, the point is that you may have things going on with you that are not normal and not perfect, but they make you who you are. They give you an identity as much as the more perfect things. In fact, if I don't know if you've ever met a perfect person, it's pretty boring. It's like, who wants that? So we're not going in that direction. That means that some of the things that are wounds and that are things you picked up along the way that are problems, working those through helps you become who you are destined to be, who you could be. So what I do is I don't work against those problems and those weaknesses. What I do is explore them further. I try to get more and more stories about them. That's one way to unwrap these things and get to know them better. So I listen to story after story after story, and then dreams too, dream after dream. And the combination of the dreams and the stories, really, that's all the material you need. I mean, you can't handle much more than that. That's a lot. And you work with that. You try to explore it with the person. And eventually, without forcing it, without knowing where you're going, that person then becomes more of an individual and feels more empowered as an individual. And that's a big issue. To have that personal power is very important. And to have a sense of a place in life and something to do.
Yeah, at one point in the book, you're providing a list of guidelines for therapy, and you write, quote, "Don't think of your friend's life as a problem to be solved, but as a complicated experience that she is trying to sort out and do well with." So it seems to align with what you just said. Really, the primary goal of therapy isn't trying to change a person or solve a problem or make something go away. I really like how you put it here. It's just getting people to a point where they're doing better with, or they're doing well with, who they already are.
Yes, I think that happens. And my experience of it is that I'm not looking for a particular outcome. I think that's a mistake, because how do I know what this person should be? And even the person herself or himself doesn't know. So what we do is try to be open-minded and accepting and honestly exploring all the possibilities and all the problems that have come, because when you sort through a problem, actually you find a strength that's been there at the core of it.
Yeah, it's one thing that I gathered from your book is just the amount of precise listening or acute listening that you should start to develop. And I know we all want to become better listeners, but I'm actually going to read something from your book just because it really clicked when I read it. You say, "A therapist needs an acute ear because she has to hear stories within and behind the stories told and reach so far in her hearing as to grasp the mystic tale, the one that only whispers in the background and yet expresses the essence of the story." So the way you describe that to me, it just makes me feel like we all need to be working on being better at listening to the layers of the words that are coming at us.
Yes, so when I talk about good listening, I'm not talking about having your ears there, not being distracted and really focused. That's okay. actually, it's not so important to me.
Mm.
I don't care if you're not focused. That's not important. The important thing is to be there, hearing more than the person is saying. And the idea behind it, and that's why I devote a whole chapter at least to this about storytelling, is that stories, every story has a bigger story in it. I quote Umberto Eco, who's an Italian novelist and university person, and he says that every story is a story that has been told before. So it's like, I like that idea very much, that when you hear someone's story, actually, Homer told it, to the ancient Greeks.
Mm.
And James Joyce told it in Finnegan's Wake. And Emily Dickinson probably told it because she was so deeply, if you want to be a good listener, and maybe even know the paintings and know really the good movies, to really have all that imagination in you so that when you hear someone tell their story, you have a rich background to receive it.
Mm-hmm. And I think you mentioned in the book too that being able to put therapists or friends' behavior or flaws or shortcomings, whatever it may be, in the context or errors, I suppose, in the context of those universal themes and those great myths that we're all familiar with that have endured throughout time, that can keep us from judging the person, that can keep us from moralizing, that can help us see ourselves in them, which I thought was really powerful, because I think so often, maybe not in the therapist patient relationship, but certainly between friends or family members, it's very easy to start becoming moralistic in our opinions of the behavior of others and trying to see how their behavior fits into a story that's 2,000 years old. It can give you the perspective you need to let go of some of that judgment.
That's really a good point. Yeah, because I think there's a natural tendency to, when you hear someone's story, to think right, whoa, what's wrong with this person? What can we do to make it better?
Yeah.
And the alternative would be to say, oh, you have such an interesting life and you've got an interesting situation there. I wonder if we can get deeper into it so it isn't bothering you quite so much. Maybe you could get a different perspective on it and it won't be such an issue.
Absolutely.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I just feel like, we live in a society where we're all so results oriented. And so we think that everything needs to have a final outcome. And you mentioned that you try to avoid that in your practice, but it's like, people have to retrain themselves that, it's not about having an answer for everything. And quite frankly, if you go into it with that, many times you're just going to be laying on your advice and your opinion, and that's not what the other person is looking for.
Yeah, so another way I put that same idea is that well, I'm reminded of a line of William Blake, the English poet. He said that I am the secretary, the authors are in eternity. In other words, as a poet, he's just writing down what he gets from the authors that are out there somewhere.
Yeah, right.
And I feel the same about therapy, whether it's formal or informal. That what the biggest job of the therapist person is to evoke the person, the figure of therapist, to evoke that in the situation and not identify with it. Like, I'm not the one making this person better. Really, it's not me. I'm only the secretary. I'm invoking or evoking some other power in human life that I hope will appear between us. And I don't mean that in a weird way. I just mean that it's a natural thing that we have this power of healing, you might say. We have that of caring. And we can evoke that. And if we do, then the situation will be pretty good. But it's not to my credit. I don't have to burst buttons on my uniform because I've done that so well. I've been the secretary, and really, thankfully, the powers have come and have helped this person, and I'm the tool. I'm the one that, is the stand-in right now for the real power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that that's something that a mindset that takes time to acquire? I imagine, I mean, you've been doing this for a really long time and you've seen people go through arcs over the course of their career. Do you think people are kind of quicker to maybe take credit take personal credit for the progress they make with patients when they're first getting into it, and then they kind of have a little bit more humility cultivated over time?
Yes, that's an excellent point. Yes, it's not something that we are automatically therefore. I think that a therapist, a professional therapist, has to go through a real initiation. That's why in some schools of thought, the therapist has to go through therapy himself or herself before. And it's not to learn things; it's to have actually having gone through that process and know what it's about, and to be able to play that role. I think it's also true among friends, though, that you've got to take your role seriously. And if some of your friends says, "Would you come and talk to me?" and all you do is go to lunch with them and talk about, their latest relationship problem or their illness, whatever it is, well, that's an important role, and you're doing something that will be good for you and for that person, and it's something serious, and you have to be at your best to do that well.
Interesting. And one thing you hit on in the book is Jay, you just mentioned the word mindset, so that triggered something around the beginner's mind, and that mindset that you mentioned in the book around. That's a great way to just wipe the slate clean, come to the conversation with no bias, no preconceived notions. And I think the fear is that people think that they're going to look stupid if they don't have something to say. But the reality is that it's better off to just go into these situations with a complete beginner's mindset.
That's really an important thing too. Another aspect of that is that when you are going to have that beginner's mind, so that you are going into it without a lot of feeling of intelligence, that you know what the person should be and that you're all skilled. Um, what happens sometimes is that people feel that they can't really help another person because they are not qualified. That's what they often feel today, because we have professionalized therapy. And one point in my book is to deprofessionalize it to some extent. Not entirely, because I admire and love so much the therapist's profession. And I love teaching therapists. I'm going to be doing that in just a couple more weeks in person. I love that. But it does a bad job on the ordinary person, because so many people think, I'm not qualified to talk to my friend. Well, of course you're qualified. You're the friend and you're a human being. You can do this. You don't need special language, or you don't have to put on a suit and tie, and charge $100 just for a conversation. You don't need to do that. Let somebody else do that. But you are qualified because you're a person, you're a friend, and some people feel anyway, I think, that they have a gift for that sort of thing. Others don't. And if you don't feel you have any gift for it, do something else. Play golf or something, but don't talk to your friend, because that's a serious thing to do. And you have to call on that power in you that can listen and that can speak carefully.
So to that point, you mentioned special language just a few seconds ago, and you mentioned about listening and speaking carefully. What is your advice or some of the techniques for someone to get another person to start opening up about some of the closest stuff to their soul? How do you get somebody to start to really open up?
You guys have very good questions. That's
you.
true. I think what you do, there are a number of things you can do to help a person open up, is yourself be open, truly open to receiving whatever they want to talk about. Now, in my practice, one of the things I notice, especially in recent years, is that I used to, when I started out, I was hoping that people would come to me wanting to talk about their dreams or Jungian something or other. And I discovered that, that's not where people are. People just, they're concerned about their issues, their problems in life. And sometimes, like today, I notice it a lot. People might come to me and they say, I'm really waiting so long to do therapy with you. And then they start talking about their car, or talking about, where they live and what they're going to do later. And like, nothing to do whatsoever with what looks like the material of their life. And what I have come to see, what I like, is that I don't steer that conversation in a different direction. What I do is it's my job to hear what the person is saying with those stories,
Mm,
that there's something that is important and is deeper. But I have to have I have to have the good sense to be able to hear it when they're saying it. So I think one of the thing about helping people talk about things is not to force them in a direction you think is good. Rather, you have to force yourself in a direction that you've never considered before.
mm,
You have to use your imagination and maybe begin to ask questions of where is this headed? What are you really talking about?
mm,
And that's one thing that helps. Another is to allow repetition. Don't worry about if people repeat the same stories. I like a lot of repetition myself. I love to hear the same stories over and over because they're all a little bit different. Each telling's a little different. And if they're
Right.
telling the story over and over, I think it means that that it's an important one. It's one of the big stories in their life. So I listen for that. I don't judge that. I don't ask for something different. And as we said before, I try to take the conversation deeper. One way I imagine that is that any person can do this. You're just having a conversation with someone, and if you would like to take it to a deeper level, all you have to do is take it down one step. Just take
yeah.
it down a little bit. Don't try to turn it into a depth analysis,
Mm,
psychoanalysis. Just take it down a step where the emotion is stronger, especially perhaps to a place where you yourself are afraid to go. If you're
mm,
afraid of something, that means it's probably significant. So
mm,
you have to go over your barriers as well as help that the other person get over their barriers. It's a two-person job. You go together, but your job as a kind of a leader of this process is to take the risk to bring up things that might take it to a more emotional place, or a place where the meaning of it is more significant. And you can do that without too much trouble. I think I do that all the time. It's part of the work. You just try to move it gradually, step by step.
mhm.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
One of the things that caught my ear when you said that was talking about how you can project your own history into these conversations as well. A therapist can do it with a patient, friends and loved ones are doing it with each other all the time. One of the most fascinating parts of your book that I really enjoyed was your conversation around reality and how very often we feel like we're all going around living in an objective reality, like what we perceive in ourselves, in others, in our environment. We perceive all of that to be true. But as you write in the book, every individual's reality is saturated by all these subjective layers, and someone else has their own subjective layers, and you have your own subjective layers, and they're kind of intersecting with each other. I was wondering if you could break down some of the language you used in that section and explain to us what the difference is between the factual, the imaginal, and the imaginary realms. Because now, after reading that section, I'm constantly trying to figure out what realm a thought is occupying. So I thought it was just such an interesting way of breaking up reality.
Yeah, so we live in a world that, as you know, is primarily factual. That's how we think. We love science, modern science, because modern science deals in facts and uses a lot of instruments to make those facts as clear, as perfect as possible. And we trust science because it is so factual. But we don't look at the filters that even the scientists are using. Or I guess some scientists talk about that today a bit, but I don't think we nearly enough are aware of the filters we have. For example, if it's a simple thing, there's so many things. If you are an old guy like me and you're talking to a bunch of young people, you have a whole different filter on life because my experience of the world has been so different. When I was living in Detroit in those early years, yes, I loved cars. I still love cars. Um, so I was influenced by being in Detroit and what that meant. Now, if I meet somebody who was born in, I don't know, in Africa or Asia, they're going to have a whole different experience from me. They have a different filter. But you can understand that even within, let's say, in a group of Americans, they're each going to have their own family filters, their own experience, where they went to school and what they learned and what their father was like and what they did. Did they play in sports? Were they eggheads? Were they nerds? So we have how we see things, and being aware of those filters. That is looking at the imaginal level. Means we're taking those filters, those images seriously. So I might say that, well, okay, someone is telling me now that they are going from job to job in their life, trying to find their place. Well, but boy, that sounds a lot to me like Odysseus. I think of the Greeks. They had this great story of Odysseus, who was this guy who was in the war, and then he tried to get home on a ship, and it took him 10 years because he kept stopping at one island after another. I mean, isn't that the image that so many of us at one time in life might be living?
Mhm.
We are on an odyssey at times, and we're lured to one island or another, and we're captivated. And we lose ourselves sometimes on one of those islands. You know what it is? You might move to another city, and there it is, another island that Odysseus has landed on, or another job, same idea. Okay, I'm a new job now. It's an island from the point of view of the Odyssey. So there's a story that's imaginal that we might be on. It's not a fact. I'm not actually on an island. Look around. I have no islands. But as a metaphor, I'm on an island. That's where I am right now. That's in the imaginal realm. That's where I am. And if I want to understand somebody, it might really help to know that they are on an odyssey. I mean, at least not to know so much, but for me to see that as a good metaphor for what they're experiencing. So I take that image of the Odyssey very seriously. I may even call the person Odysseus or Ulysses or something, just to make it real. Or I'll say, oh boy, Odysseus has come and has entered your life again. Well, I don't mean that somebody's knocked on your door. What I mean is that the spirit of Odysseus is now in you once again. It's kind of drifted into you, and you're back on this journey.
Mm.
And so that's the imaginal realm. Now, if someone wanted to say that Odysseus did knock on my door, that's imaginary.
Got it.
And in that case, we have a lot of work to do.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. So it seems like most of the time, at least in the sessions with your patients, you're trying to live in that imaginal world. And actually, I really liked in the book too how you talk about how seeing things in stories can enrich the conversation more than just plain language can. Like if a client is talking about their symptoms and they're, I don't know, saying they feel angry or feel anxious, there's much more to work with if you can put those emotions in the context of a story and kind of assign a character, an imaginal character to what they're experiencing instead of letting it just live in these sort of abstract descriptions.
Yes, Jung said that. I quote Jung in that place. Jung is very good. You know, I'm not a Jungian analyst because I just don't want to be limited to any system, but he's very, very good. And I read him all the time. And he says this, that the emotions by themselves without an image or without a narrative can be very disturbing and upsetting. So if all you have is an emotion, you're depressed and you have no idea what's going on, that is more painful and more difficult than if you have some sense that you're in a story here. There's some story taking place. And if I have a story for it, not the story, there's no absolute story, but a good story or I can tell a story about it that makes sense to me. For example, I use myself. I think I use this example in the book. When I was 4 years old, my grandfather drowned, saving me when our boat capsized on a big lake. Well, sometimes I think to myself, maybe some of my kind of depressive mood. I'm not exactly the life of the party most of the time. Some of that depressive character that I have, I don't like to use the word depressive, but maybe kind of a low key, not really life of the party person. I wonder sometimes if that had to do with that early experience of death with my grandfather dying in that tragic situation. And so there's my narrative, see? That may not, factually, I don't know. Maybe I can find another way of looking at that character that I have. But this is a pretty good one. It's a pretty good story. And I tell myself that story. It's one of my narratives. It's something that happened to me early in my life. It's something, I think those early stories are very good ones to use to connect to our emotions even later. Just to be able to have a narrative that at least takes us away toward appreciating what's going on. So Jung is saying that you're better off. You're in a much better place if you can have one or two or three stories about your mood or your emotion than just having the emotion itself with no way of making sense of it.
Yeah, provides a little boundary to it. And also, I mean, the one takeaway I have so far is that we can, if we're trying to, fill some of the gaps that we have in our own approach to this, is we can all maybe read more fairy tales and more myths and just be more acquainted with stories that go back 2,000 years ago, because a lot of those themes are still universal.
Yes, absolutely. So that's why I would recommend in my school of psychotherapy, therapists in training would be reading a lot of mythology and the great novels and plays and looking at great paintings. And as I said before, watching really excellent movies. Because a movie can do the same. The movie could give you a great image. A lot of movies, I think, are just an expression of our complexes, of the problems we have. They don't really give us an image that can guide us. But some movies do. Some movies give us very strong images that will help us get through a certain process in our lives.
One of the most interesting parts of the book for me was when you were talking about transference and how that plays itself out. So I'd love for you to dig deeper into that. But the reason I'm bringing that up is just because after reading that section, I have a complete newfound respect for what a therapist has to do while their client is sitting in that chair and just talking about how, nobody likes them or whatever the case may be. That balancing act that a therapist is going through, the next time you go to your therapist, just acknowledge what they have to balance. And I think that will go a long way. But I would love for you to just talk more about transference and how even just an average person can think about that in their therapeutic sessions.
Yeah, I'll try. It's a big topic, but I'll try to say it briefly. So the transference is a concept and a term that the early psychoanalysts used quite a lot. Early on, people thought of it as a transfer where they were very interested in childhood and parents. So let's say you meet somebody new today in a business situation. You go and, whatever it is, you could just go and have a business meeting and you meet somebody who's powerful. And what you might end up doing is transferring your image of your father to that businessman that you meet, or your mother to that woman. Although it could also be cross-gender, because a lot of men are more maternal. But anyway, you might be influenced then. You might notice that you're relating to them just like you would to your father. And that probably was a complicated relationship. And so therefore, your current relationship with this new person might be quite complicated because it's so much like your father.
Right.
That's the way a lot of people might think of transference, which is not too bad. But I present it differently, more along the lines of Jung. Jung says that we don't transfer our parents onto somebody else. What we do is when we're children, we encounter the experience and the power of father and mother in our parents. And later, when you meet another person who's pretty strong and important to you, you may encounter that mother, father again. You have a different encounter now, but here it is once again to the archetypal mother and father, the great mother and father again. That may be influenced by your experience of your parents, colored by it. But the main thing is that you're seeing a father in this person. And that is the issue. And that's going to complicate things. If you meet this business person and you're treating them as your father, it's nice, but you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And especially in trouble with the influence of your own personal father that's also in the picture. So that might have been very, very complicated relationship. And here you go again. Another complication that Jung offers and Hellman offered that I like a lot is that when you meet somebody, you're coming with, imagine how many people you've met in your life
Yeah.
and how many you've read about. You're coming with thousands of people in your imagination and this tank behind you or this cloud. I like to think of it as a cloud that's surrounding us of all these figures.
Yeah.
And that person's coming with a cloud of figures. And you meet and you've got it's almost like a convention. You have so many of these people coming together and some will stand out, but who knows who? I don't like to limit transference to the parents. I'd say that you could be transferring anybody to the
Right.
person, the new person you're meeting now. In other words, you might see them powerfully through the filter of someone either you've met before or you've read about before. Might be a movie star, it might be, who knows what, a figure in fiction or in a movie. Movies are powerful that way because they give us these almost like mythic images that and the thing is we're not aware, we're not conscious that we're doing this. But in spite of that, our relationship now might be heavily influenced by whatever fantasy figure has entered the picture. Out of all those possibilities, that's transference. There's a transference from your collection of figures to this new person coming along. You've taken one out of all these people, and now you see this new person through the filter of one of your own figures. And that's going to complicate your relationship. And the funny thing about this, and they all say this, is that all it takes is a tiny thing. And this person may have their hair arranged in a certain way. It may be their eyes, what their eyes look like. It might be a beard in a man. It might be a mark on the face. It might be a gesture that they make or a word they keep using. That's all it takes to transfer this old person to the new one. And then the thing is, it's hard to shake it. From now on, you're going to relate to this person with these two, it's like stereo, these double, two figures.
Yeah.
And that's complicated. So the therapist then has to be aware that their client is probably going to come with a lot of fantasy about who you are and what you do. And it would be a good idea if you notice what is developing. It might be a parent. It might be, they may see you as a parent. They may see you as a doctor. They may see you as someone who knows everything. They may see you as all heart. You're just a person who, whatever it is, they're going to come to you with that. And you have to watch out that you don't play into that fantasy that they're placing on you or that they're seeing you with. And that, if you do play into it, that's called the counter-transference. The therapist then responding rather unconsciously, usually, to whatever fantasy that person has about you, image that they see you through. So I think this idea of transference and countertransference is very interesting. And I think it actually works. It's part of the encounter, even with people who are not professionals.
And it can be tempting, I'm sure, to play into the countertransference if whatever a patient or just a friend is transferring onto you is a sort of flattering image. If someone sees you as the father and they have a very positive conception of what that means, it's tempting to want to play into that, even if it's unrealistic.
One of the fantasies is they see you as the all healthy person who can do no wrong. That your life is not messed up, mine is. And you might be thinking to yourself as you listen to them, boy, I hope I can do this because I've got the same problems myself. It's complicated. The whole thing is complicated. And it's not just a clear, factual connection between two people who know themselves and know what's going on. It's filled with these stories and figures and elements that of fiction, you might say, of imagination, that it wouldn't hurt to be aware of.
Absolutely. You know what else becomes complicated is the fact that we all do suffer from our own set of complexes all the time, right? So you talk about it in the book, like, just think about the situation where you're sitting next to someone and you find out that they're much better read than you are, more well-traveled, maybe they're better skilled at something, and all of a sudden you start to feel inferior. You might start to feel jealous, and then next thing you know, you start to act in a completely different way. You're not even the same person anymore. It's like your ego has become possessed. It's like a split ego. So, we all have our own complexes, which makes things a lot more complicated. But what do you think that a complex can actually teach us?
Well, a complex, I would say, and again, I'm so indebted to Jung on this. He wrote so much about complexes. Um, it's like, I see it like raw material of who you are, what you could be. It's the raw material. It's raw, so it's not very, it's not adapted to your life very well. It comes in like separate thing, like Jung called it a fragment of the psyche. It comes in like an autonomous, again, his word, autonomous figure, like this inferiority thing. You don't want it. It's something that comes along. You'd much rather not have that feeling,
Yeah.
but it comes on you anyway. So eventually, see, I would say that if you can be with somebody therapeutically, again, a friend or a professional therapist, talking about it, you might come to the point where that inferiority will turn into humility or vulnerability, some other quality that's really not so bad. It's really quite good. And so the complex is, you might say, is trying to get you to discover this power that is not very attractive to you, maybe, but is actually quite good.
One of the things you write in the book on complexes is how there can sometimes be two parts to it. You write strong complexes almost always come in two extreme parts, one clear and visible and the other fuzzy and hidden. And you write about how sometimes what we think we need is actually the exact opposite of what we actually need. You give an example of someone who might feel that they're hyper passive and they need to take more control of their relationships. But in reality, based on what the other people around them might be saying or what you as a therapist might be saying in them, they might actually be very controlling of others in ways that they can't see, that they're blind to. And really what would serve them best is not taking more control, but actually getting comfortable relinquishing some of their control. So I'm curious, I know it's again a pretty big question, but how can we stay vigilant against our own self-deception, and how can we determine if something that's bothering us, if something that we have identified as a complex actually has a hidden part to it, kind of has the bottom of the iceberg that might not be intuitive, but might be just as important to confront as the visible part?
Well, what I say usually to that is we all have to learn, like, let's say with our computers, most people use computers or smartphones. You have to learn a lot in order to use them well. I mean, you don't just pick those things up and go along with it, just use it. You can't. You have to learn something. It's the same with speaking therapeutically to somebody. You got to learn a little bit about it. And one of the things you could learn in a half hour, this is not rocket science, you could learn that these complexes do come in oppositions. And you could expect the opposite to be present somehow. That's what I do. I think in oppositions. I learned that from Carl Jung again. He always said to think in oppositions, in opposites. And so when someone tells me something, especially if it's quite passionate or told in such a way that I don't fully believe it, it doesn't sound quite right, I'll consider the opposite. I'll consider, well, I bet the opposite side of this thing is around somewhere, and I'll keep my eye out for it. I won't be led along this path to just see one side of it, which is really what the person wants me to see, because that's where they usually want to go. They don't want you to see this other side that is not so pretty. But I like the not so pretty side. I always keep in mind what Lewis Carroll said in Alice Through the Looking Glass. He talks about the importance of learning ambition, distraction, and uglification. Uglification. So I do that. I think I need to be an uglifier. I need to be able to have an appreciation for the ugly side. Otherwise, I'm not going to be doing a good job. I have to listen for that. And I have to not be offended or concerned about it or try to get out of it, but rather to say, oh, yeah, I know what's going on there. I've considered this. I've reflected on it. I have the same kind of opposites in myself. So then I go along with the person then, and I'm not led in the wrong direction in that one-sided view of things.
You know where people might really want to know a little bit more about soul and soul therapy and caring for the soul is how it could be done in the workplace. So from your book, I just wanted to read this and then ask you your thoughts. But you talk about how the workplace is teeming with matters of soul. The workplace itself may be screaming with difficult emotions and relationships. Hierarchies are often a problem. Successful people often can't deal well with authority and leadership and make life difficult for those under them. Work usually creates anxiety about making enough money or keeping a job. A person's sense of worth and the very meaning of life often depends on what they're doing at work or what happens at work. And then you have workers who have to spend hours with others who are very different from them. There's competition for recognition and promotions and higher positions in corner offices. And then there's all types of relationships. Some are friendly, some are toxic, and some are erotic. So let me ask you, if you were going to help a company become more psychologically sophisticated, what are a few of the many issues that you would focus on first?
I would, first of all, encourage a company to have somebody who knows about these things, speak to them, to the workers, or at least the managers and the people who run the place, to begin to develop a psychological attitude, a therapeutic attitude in the place, in the first place. Because we need that. That would be a good start. And then when you begin to focus on specifics, you might even have, I don't know how companies do this exactly, but you could have, let's say, a theme a month or a theme every time you get together every 6 months where you have a psychological issue. And let's say we're going to talk today about complexes, and we're going to figure out how they appear on the job. And it wouldn't take much to ask people about that. I've done this. I've worked in hospitals this way, and I'll ask doctors and nurses about some of their complexes, and they come out pretty readily. I don't have to push hard at all. People are very happy to get it off their chest, say what their complexes are. It's very easy.
It's like thanking you for asking. It's like, thank
Yeah,
God somebody's asked.
That's right, exactly. And it's kind of fun too, because finally there's a kind of release when this happens. Although then it can become more serious and difficult. But I think that kind of guidance would be great. I wish that more therapists would prepare themselves to work in businesses. I think it would be a very good idea to have some way. I know that businesses have coaches that work with them in many ways, but sometimes some coaches are more therapeutic and some are not. It depends on their orientation.
And usually those are for more senior people, right? Like
Yeah,
the average coworker, I mean, for them to be able
true.
to tap into somebody else's heart and just
True.
be able to have that kind of conversation, I think is not normal.
I've done this many times. I've in various professions. I've gone in and I've got the workers together, just the ordinary workers, sometimes in large numbers. You don't have to, it's no big deal. It's not that big a thing. You go in, you know a lot about this thing. I usually try to let them know that I know these things. I try to win their confidence by letting them know that I've studied this. I really know what I'm talking about. Instead of just trying to be, kind of, I don't know what, to just hold their hands or something, but to really, really make it solid and significant and teach them about how to think more psychologically, like we're doing right now, talking about complexes, things like that. A little bit goes a long way. They begin to see, there's more going on in relationships than I realized. And I think there's a lot we could do, not only in businesses, but also, let's say, in politics, people who in government. because most government people seem not to have ever heard of psychology. They just try to solve problems all the time, very literally as they come, with a lot of bias, without awareness of their own issues and the stories being lived out.
There's a lot of projection, definitely, in terms of projecting the villain onto your counterparty in Washington.
Yes.
There was another chunk of your book I think that's important to talk about. I know we just have a couple more minutes here, but it's around parenting and parents as therapists. So I'm going to ask you a 3-part question just because of the essence of time that we have. But how can parents offer therapy to their children? What challenges do new parents face when they have to start caring for another soul? And what would you say is the parent's role as a therapist and educator in their child's life?
Okay, I'll try to take them not exactly in that order. I think the first thing the parent has to do is realize that being a parent is not just being yourself. This is a position you have. You are a very special person to these children. And your role is not just to react out of your own passions for your own sake. Your role is to be a parent. And there are many, many times when your role is to speak therapeutically to your child. Your child needs the kind of response from you that will help them clarify and comfort them with their confusing emotions. I think parents have to do that constantly. Not always, but very often. So if they had been, let's say, taught or given them the possibility that you could actually speak therapeutically instead of screaming at your child, that would be a great advance. So part of it is enter the role of parent then. It's like an initiation into this role. It's not something you do unconsciously. You should think about it, read about it, maybe attend a workshop about being a parent. Don't just do it blindly. Like I said before, you wouldn't do that with a cell phone. You wouldn't just say, I'm just going to use it suddenly. You need to read about it, take some lessons in it, and talk to an expert. And I think I don't remember how exactly you put it, but that's about the best I can say, I think.
No, absolutely. It's so parenting is obviously not a check the box situation, because there's just so much that goes on. And, for, especially a new parent, those first couple of months, you're caring for a new soul. You could be projecting so much on that child that could be influencing them for the rest of their life.
And there's something archetypal, what I mean by that universal, deeply human, about an older person relating to a child. That is something itself that you have to reflect on and think about. A lot of times parents, I think, relate to their child the way they were related to by their parents. You got to think that through. I would have a little retreat for parents where all they do is discuss how they were treated by their parents.
Wow.
And maybe be freed of that influence, because you see that all the time. They do the same, even though they suffered at the hands of their parents in some ways. They do the same to their kids.
And I think a big part of their responsibility comes from the fact that kids don't have any context coming into the world. Like if you have a friend that's pretty gruff and you know that this to be true about the friend, if they're rude to you or cold to you or mean to you or even wrathful towards you, you can put it in the context of what you know about their personality. But when you're a kid at 2 or 3 years old and you're experiencing maybe, emotions that are unhinged coming down from your parents, you can't put that in the context of their life or really in the context of life itself. It just feels like the world has kind of turned against you because to a large extent, your parents are your world when you're in those really formative years. So it can be devastating if parents aren't, as you put it, conscious of their role as a parent and they're just sort of living from the place of their own ego.
I'd put it this way. To a child, a parent is not a person. To a child, a parent is a father or a mother, which is great, huge. The great mother, the great father, they're big. What you really should have in your home is a huge 12-foot puppet of mother and father, because that's what they're seeing. That's who you are. You're not a person. You're this huge being. And you have to speak carefully because your words and your behavior are so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So from your book, I think something that people can chew on, I'll read this, is love and acceptance fill the atmosphere of a soul-oriented home. You don't have to push your child to do anything, but only trust the seed of a self that you glimpse. Over time, it will unfold into a creative individual if you don't interfere.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I think the main job of the parent is not to make the child into a little version of themselves. They should know that's not going to work. It doesn't. They can't think that highly of themselves. But they really could pay attention to their child as that child that emerges as an individual, unique, in various ways. And they do that when they're very young, very, very young. And if you can do that from the beginning all the way until, the end, even when they become adults, as a parent, if you can do that, you're doing a good job.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would just say that, so from what I've heard in this conversation, it's just further proof that we should have a much wider perspective. Like we should be proactively seeking these types of perspectives on life. It's going to help us relate to ourselves and relate to other people better. Clearly, therapy can happen between anyone. It doesn't have to be professional. It can happen in everyday situations. And so it's just this idea of like understanding the importance of having therapy taking place in the world and for the world, and that's how you can connect to people. I do have a question since you are with us. I might as well ask you, what is your view on what's going on in society right now as it relates to what we're seeing with people acting up on planes? I mean, is this like a frustration that's being projected out collectively? Like, what is your view on what we're seeing as people are re-entering society and seemingly having a tough time, like getting along with each other? I would imagine that through the pandemic and what we all went through and some of the loss that we suffered, people would feel more connected to each other. But I just feel like frustrations are boiling over. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for one thing, people have been very frustrated all along, and there's been a lot of division. Even during COVID, there's been a lot of division between people, like whether to wear masks or not, and whether to be vaccinated or not. And it's not just that there's differences, but people demonize each other because of that. So there's something happening here where we haven't handled the situation too well from the very beginning. And what is that all about? I mean, I think what we have to do is look deeply into ourselves as a society and realize that we haven't really created a world that is humane, that is good for humans. We've created a world of machines, really machines that are not. That's not who we are. We have not created better schools for children, where they can learn how to relate and to think deeply about things. We haven't done that. We've made it all mechanical. So we're very proud of a very mechanical future for ourselves. But I rarely hear of people saying that, oh, I can imagine the future. Marriages are going to be more tender and more lasting. We don't think that way. We think about machines. So that's where we are, and I think we're making the world that somehow we want, and it's not going to help us.
Well, again, the book is called Soul Therapy. Right there, it's an absolute must read. This is a book that I'm going to be telling plenty of people about. Completely changed my perspective. I just realized how many gaps I have as I continue my progress to try to be a better listener and be more compassionate. And while there have been strides made, there's plenty to go. So I would encourage people to pick this book up. And Thomas, before we let you go, one final question for you, which is, if you could be an animal, any animal for one day, what would you be and why?
Well, let's see. The fox comes to mind. A fox. He's called Sly. I like the way foxes walk. We have them around our house here. And one of them came up to me very close recently, just walked right up to me.
Oh,
I
wow.
didn't know what to do. I thought, should I pet him or what?
Do I play dead?
I liked it. I also like the fox well, I was thinking of coyote, which is like a fox, too, related in Native American stories. He's a trickster. I think that we haven't discussed this here today, but it's very important. If we want to be with somebody, we have to be a bit of a trickster at the same time.
I'm curious now. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Now I am really fascinated with that idea of the importance of the trickster. When I think I hear trickster, I think of the negative connotation, but what's the positive significance of it?
The religious traditions have a very positive view of tricksters. And what they mean is that we have to be witty. I think that we need to be witty. I don't think we're nearly witty enough. We have to be witty with language and witty with our ideas. We're way too sincere, either sincerely pious and sincerely kind or sincerely evil. We're all those things. It would help us a lot if we were insincerely all those things. If we had a little more, we could step back from them and maybe not be so upfront all the time and hold back on some of our ideas and thoughts and be more clever and thoughtful about what we say and what we do. It's the wittiness that I think, the wit, using your intelligence in a crafty way, that's really important. And we act that out in maybe doing business in a immoral way, but I think you can be crafty in a very positive way.
Absolutely. And that kind of reminds me of a couple of other themes in your book around just the idea of neutrality and the idea of waiting.
Yes.
So again, those are two big chunks of the book that will also change people's perspectives.
Yes. We have to wait. We have to have the power of waiting and being neutral, not always taking a side. I think a therapist is especially advised to be neutral, to not react so emotionally at whatever comes along, to be neutral, let it happen.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Thomas. I got a lot out of the book and this conversation as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it. Enjoyed talking to you.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglatterly.com.
Thank you.